Points of information in the chat. Also, I have a mild preference that people keep their cameras on, including other speakers in the audience, because I think it keeps the vibe a little bit better, but no problem, no pressure to do so. Okay. I want to start with an intuition, because I think this question is not meaningfully distinct from the question of whether an adopted child can meaningfully call their true parents their parents. I think it's not meaningfully distinct from that, asking whether biology should control our lives, whether it should control our systems of ownership and property, or whether humans ourselves can decide how we should attribute the idea of belonging. In terms of setup, I have a couple of things I want to say. Firstly, I think that I just want to make it really clear for the debate, because I don't want it to get messy. I want to say that we can refer to the couple that's receiving this as couple A, and the other couple as couple B. So couple A is the group that we're saying has ownership, whereas couple B is the group on the other side. Secondly, this is a mix-up that's happened in an IVF facility. It was clarified in the motion clarification thing, but it means that there was no fault at hand in either of the couples in deciding this. It's just an act of luck. The third thing I want to say is that belonging is distinct from your course of action, so, which is to say that what you do as a result of making this decision is completely detached from the question as to which group this embryo belongs to, because other moral factors can come into play there. I also think that the question of belonging takes place and must apply for like the 1 second before this thing has been discovered, right? So it's about a question of like right now, as we're discovering this information, who belongs to whom. But even if you think that belonging, and this is going to be a brief even if argument, it should be considered in terms of the effects that it will draw. I think that it would be really, really harmful if you tell a woman who's been carrying this embryo for several months now and has been caring for it and has been struggling with things that change over the course of pregnancy, changes to her body, to hormones, etc., that this thing within her does not meaningfully belong to her. I think that could be deeply traumatic and deeply harmful. So if you want to weigh the debate on that end, I think that should be sufficient to deal with it. That being said, I have 3 arguments in opening government today. The first claim is on the discontinuity of identities. This is to say that the embryo as it exists now is meaningfully distinct from how it existed at the moment of its inception or at the moment it was taken out and changed from those 2 people, which is to say that an embryo changes over time due to the nutrition that comes into its manufacturing or its creation, into how it's treated by the parents that have received it, and in terms of just like the biology that happens over time, which is to say, you can see this in ideas like fetal alcohol syndrome, for example, right, where the embryo changes over time based off the actions of the mother in those instances. And insofar as this is a meaningful, significant change to this embryo, it means that the embryo, insofar as it exists now, and notably labor has gone into this change, the actions of the mother and also probably the other prospective parent in that dynamic as well, means that there has been a significant change that's happened through people's actions. The important thing of this is to note that, for example, if I were to go outside and chop down a tree in a forest, maybe nobody owns that tree as of yet, but when I chop it down and I make it into a chair through the act of carpentry, it becomes my chair because it has meaningfully transformed its identity from its initial act as just being wood. The material was not in and of itself the important component of its identity, but the intention that's gone into that action over time. So they're meaningfully distinct things. And look, you can think that a harm has been done to both of these parents, and I'd be inclined to agree with you on that. That doesn't mean that the philosophical attribution of the concept of belonging should come under that headline. Second thing here is on moral luck. We think that obviously this is an unintentional act, or at the very least it was unintentional on behalf of the 2 prospective groups of parents. But I don't think that this unintentionality and this randomness is meaningfully distinct than the randomness that goes into the construction of childhood in general, which is to say there's randomness in which sperm meets the egg, there's randomness on which day conception happens, there's randomness in who meets who over the course of their life, and there's randomness in all other things which could go into these things, which is to say that there's a significant degree of randomness here that is, I think, compounded by the increased randomness that's happened. And if you can't prove to me that this individual act of randomness is meaningfully distinct from the act of randomness that went into the conception of the embryo in the first place, I don't think belonging can be brought about, because belonging necessitates a concept of responsibility. That which is in our belonging is that which we are responsible for. If a child belongs to me, it is understood that I have an act of caring in the life of that child that comes under those headlines. But we think that moral obligations as such must necessarily be opted into in order to be meaningful, because you cannot be responsible for things in your life over which you have no significant degree of control. For example, if I were to, go to Matt Caito's house and drop off like the obligation to care for everyone in the world and say, this is your responsibility now, or ask him to donate $10,000 to the nearest charity because he will be able to help out in those things. He doesn't have an obligation to do so because he hasn't opted into it. Rather, we think that belonging requires an optionality of responsibility. And the prospective parents here have chosen to care for this embryo, have chosen to take it under their responsibility, have chosen to care for it. And with that active fulfillment of moral obligation or acceptance of the terms of that moral obligation, therewith comes the concept of belonging. I think we oftentimes understand this as an idea in society. The other end of this, for example, is why we think that it's legitimate to tax rich people, because we believe that a significant proportion of their property, their income, comes through things which are arbitrary, which played upon moral luck, and therefore they have no meaningful degree of ownership over. So moral luck necessitates that this cannot be the claim of ownership that exists here. A final thing I want to note is on choice, but before I do, I'll take closing opposition.
Just to be very clear about the logical extension of the principle you're claiming, would you extend the same sort of principle of ownership to babies that were mixed up after birth between two families, where one baby goes home from the hospital with the wrong family and then later on subsequently discover there's a mistake?
Well, no, if you looked at my analysis, it was about the care that's happened to the embryo over time and the choice to care for it. So that would be meaningfully, or that would be different. But for example, if there was a mix-up that wasn't noticed for 15 years, then we would extend this analysis to it, right, as we would intuitively do. So it's the logic of the analysis that's important there. Final claims on choice. So belonging requires choice because belonging is a degree of intentionality. Like belonging isn't something that we can find out in nature. Belonging isn't something that's like a mathematical or geographical phenomenon. It's a human construct. It's a tulpa. It's the assignment of choice and value to a particular set of relationships between people. And therefore, insofar as it is a human construct, it requires intentionality to be constructed and to be ideated. In this instance, the act of intentionality came on behalf of the parents who chose to continue to care for that embryo, to maintain it as being in their stead, and to keep a hold of it in the context of their lives moving forward. So, what have we proven to you in opening government today? And we've proven to you that the logical claims of ownership from opening opposition and closing opposition cannot be manifest because they play on things that are ultimately arbitrary and from which no claim of belonging can come. We've also forwarded a legitimate claim as to why belonging can be manifest on our side of the house through the act of intentionality and choice that has gone into the choice to care for these things. I think I'm pretty proud to propose because I do really believe that this would be a crazy thing to oppose because I don't think that it's legitimate to say that biology or genetics should control our identity. I think that that's not what we decide. I think it's us that decides. Very proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech. Let's next invite the Leader of Opposition.
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Most likely I'll take a POI within the 5th minute. If I don't take it, kindly feel free to ask via voice and just draw my attention to it. And most likely I'll take one from closing opposition. Get a chance to engage the extension. I would like to start by making a couple of clarifications, and judges, I would like you to take note of this, that opening opposition does not respond to anything which we say. Notice that 7 minutes of the argumentation makes one claim only, that these couples have a level of body autonomy and therefore have a level of ownership over the genetic material which was given. It doesn't respond to all of the arguments that Dylan gives you, because this is even a concession that we're willing to make, right? It doesn't respond to all of the argumentation that Dylan gives you on the transformation of it. Therefore, the specific defense of this is not to defend a part of the body of the couple where they have ownership of, but then to defend why the transformed product necessarily belongs to the couple which is saying it has lost the baby. What the argumentation Dylan gives you is to show why the value being moved from 0 to 1 or being moved from 1 to 5 is heavily influenced by this particular couple A, and therefore they have a level of ownership to this. So I don't think any of the analysis they make necessarily deal with this or attack this in any way, because this is a concession that we can make. Secondly, also, I don't think there are not reasons to justify why there is some form of ownership on their side of the house. But I think what this debate is asking us specifically to do is to weigh all those justifications of ownership. Dylan is the only one who does this weighing, where he weighs and tells you biology should not be the ultimate determinant of ownership. These guys defend why biology should be the ultimate determinant, but do not engage all of the other analysis we give you around intention, around action and action, randomness, and ownership in this kind of extent. And therefore, we think our analysis is untouched and is still leading. Let me go to some level of specificity, even dealing with bodily autonomy. They say that you have bodily autonomy claimed to your genetic matter, and you only give written consent to give it out. I think this is established at the point at which this couple consented to give birth. Because when you do so, you choose to give out a part of your body in order to make this being which is independent in and of itself. So at that point, that consent is established. But secondly, Dylan also makes the argument that body should not dictate everything. It is for the very reason that we say that trans people are legitimate, because their body should not be a determinant of every other thing which most likely they should own or they should get. It is a reason why we do believe that possession of one of your sex organ is not a determinant of every other thing which you are likely to get within the world. Thirdly, I think they fail to also acknowledge that process of transformation which Dylan talks about, which is that when this also goes into you, it is your pancreas, it is your body juices, it is also items which comes from your body, which essentially helps to take care of this. The only way that they try to wiggle out of this is to say there is some genetic matter, but recognize that this is not comparative, and that this genetic matter is also dependent on all of the other subsequent action, which we necessarily point out, and therefore can't be the determining factor. I think all of it due to the normalization, which like Dylan tells you, is around adoption and how it can create a sense of ownership. I don't think this principle is even absolute in this extent. The next thing they say is that this couple is denied the feeling of being able to raise their child. There are lots of things which the info slide and emotion does not make clear. Given that it was an error, there's a possibility that they also took the embryo of these other people, which then also puts all of these circumstances of not being able to get the feeling of being able to raise their children, etc. But then also it is the denial of intention at that specific point in time. For couple A, this is the child that they are expecting. I think that in itself increases the intention and the level of impact they feel from not having their child. And that's what Dylan explains to you, that the consequence of loss is far more impactful on the side of couple A, given that it was that specific intention that led to that claim. I think the establishment of this means that there is no case, especially for these guys. I'll take a POI from MCO.
Yeah, surely it's the case that given genetic material is so fundamentally critical to individuals that you can't prioritize the potential harm of a parent not being able to raise a child over the ownership that we have on our side.
So I don't understand why you guys do this thing. You just said, oh, genetic material is the most critical thing. You need to give analysis why it overrides every other thing which we've said within this debate, like the randomness of it, which Dylan explains to you are all things that you necessarily need to go against. You guys don't just get a claim by saying genes are nice. I'm a biotechnology student. They are not special like that. There are a couple of things which Dylan brings to you, which I think necessarily wins us the debate. First of all, it is that discontinuity in identity. So let's say, like maybe you come across a planet, or maybe because we live in Ghana, I come across gold. Geography seems to be the most proximate form of ownership, given that there was no prior ownership to this. It means that the ways by which we are able to form ownership is always a social construct, just like Dylan tells you. But more specifically in this case, it is a case of being able to raise from no value at all, or very little value at all, and adding tremendous value. We say the gap between it just being a genetic material and it's being a full living embryo, which is essentially it becomes a human being, is too massive. It means that the transformation process plays this very huge role in it. This genetic material, which you're talking about from the other couple, is easily replaceable in the sense that they have multiple choices to be able to, I don't know, like get like genetic material is not the hardest thing to come by. I think the most grueling one is that 9 months of pregnancy, being able to put it through that intent, that care, and I think that's where most of the production does come in. Dylan also posits that randomness presents fair choices in these instances, because belonging then connotes a sense of responsibility, also connotes a level of intention to fulfill this responsibility. Given that this has been adequately fulfilled by this specific couple in being able to raise that, I think that ownership does belong to them. It is also the optionality of that responsibility, which they then have been able to, indulge themselves or subscribe to, which the other guys have not. So it may be that maybe it's a sad story. It may be that it is an unfortunate thing. It may be that you even claim that they have some level of right to some level of compensation due to all of the narratives that surround this. But I think what this argument specifically does is prove exclusively why this ownership should belong. Now, to like framing like other things, I don't think that any team can be able to win based on the level of outcomes which is likely to come to this child, given that the determination that we're talking about is based on the value of the product as it exists at the moment. We have zero information on the future to be able to make this level of determination. So this debate is not about where the child would end up, but where the child is right now and where essentially it's ending up. Consequences are hard to weigh, hard to predict and contextualize, and we have no control over it. So we think if we are making this decision now, the couple A has the ownership, and we think that's exclusively on our side. Thank you.
Thank the Prime Minister for that speech. I'll also next invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Cool. POIs in the chat, please. I have a preference for opening opposition. Like opening government, I want to start with an intuition. When you're a parent and you have a child, and maybe you disrespect the child, and the state views you that you can no longer take care of this child properly, what the state does is it comes and takes the child from you. It says that you no longer have the belonging or the responsibility of this kid anymore. What this demonstrates against opening opposition is quite lethal. This shows you that utility does matter as much, even if opening government doesn't think it does. What I'm going to prove to you is, on balance of probability, we could be more certain that these two people will look after this kid better, and this is the way in which we ought to arbitrate belongingness. The first way I'm going to show you this is by showing you why opening government's reasonings are insufficient. Opening government has 4 reasons. First is identity information. Recognize that if I chopped Parth's arm off, I am changing them in my identity. But that doesn't mean I own them, right? Maybe the analogy works for a tree, but not an individual person, because that person has an individual autonomy of themselves. Suggests that identity transformation is quite counterintuitive. The second is, the belonging comes because the parents opted into it. We have no knowledge of whether or not the other parents would have chosen to opt into the child if they now know it exists. If these parents now know this kid exists, they could have opted into this as well. Why does the primacy matter of opting in? There is yet any reason for this. Third is intentionality. There is no reason to believe that these parents intended to have a child that was genetically different from them. The Infoslide suggests not. Therefore, the intentionality is asymmetrically different. And therefore intentionality doesn't seem to be in this instance. Fourthly, it's proximity. This seems very counterintuitive. If I am closer to your child than you are, just because I'm standing closer to them, does not mean they belong to me more than they belong to you. Suggesting that proximity is not the moral metric to which deserves deservedness. What I'm going to argue is it is the consequence that you have on the child, and I will weigh to why this is the reason to which belongingness emerges, not the reasons opening government rather gave. The way I'm going to start doing this is by showing you why this is true against opening opposition. The first and broad response I have is they claim as a genetics is an extension of bodily autonomy, and then try to argue why genetics is impermanent to the situation you're in. If this is true, it doesn't matter where the child is. It is always a genetic extension of you from the moment it is born to the moment it dies. You've already satisfied your desire to have genetics pushed in. 3 responses, though, to the idea of, and I'm going to flow into the impact here. First, they say you cannot rob people of autonomy. My intuition suggests you can rob them of the autonomy of the control of another person, because that person is an individual of their own right and has experiences that the state must also protect them. Recognize we also, trivially, do deprive individuals of agency for utility all the time. 1, prisons. We take people out of their homes, lock them in the cage because we think they're a harm more to other people than they are if they were in society, suggesting that we do deprive individuals of their autonomy when consequences matter. Second, for only individuals, we may place them into mental health care, isolate them from the community and isolate them essentially from their own capacity to harm themselves if we believe that their agency would be directly harmful. This suggests in 2 intuitions, agency doesn't actually fall prior to utility, utility does, and the abuse example I talked about. Recognize also that the parents consented to give their genetic information out. It therefore seems probable that they're not robbed of their autonomy because they made an active choice to lose the capacity to control or access genetic information. There is no reason to opening opposition to why this is untrue or why we should override the initial agency of the person just because opening opposition needs to win the debate. The second is we ought to prolong the identity of the child. As I've already said, the identity of the child, if it's genetically entwined, as opening opposition argues, aren't being changed by that. They can't have their cake and eat it against opening government. Finally, that certain situations We may lose agency, but we shouldn't use it for children. Here's why we should. Recognize that the thing that an embryo is the not just the potentiality, but the inevitability of life. Left alone, the embryo will continue to develop into an individual that will live probably some degree of experience. Even if it's 1 second, that is still 1 second of experience where that individual has only the capacity to feel and think things, which means that we should think about whether or not that person that will rear the child is going to be, ought to belong to it and ought to have the authority to control how that child feels. I think this is for a number of reasons against opening government here. Opening government tries to frame this extension out preemptively by claiming you cannot arbitrate belongingness based on cause. I think you can. If you have probable cause to believe somebody is not going to look after a dog very nicely because they haven't planned for the dog very well, or maybe they've abused the dog in the past, they forfeit preemptively their right to access to the dog, which means it is temporally linked, i.e. the embryo is not currently a child, but the embryo does infer how you will treat the child in the future. I think we have a knowledge of how the parents are going to take care of their embryo insofar as we can watch them. And I'm going to give you loads of reasons in a second why they're likely taking care of the embryo very well now, and hence gives you an indication that they are going to give you very well in the future. These are the reasons, 6 reasons. Firstly, I think pregnancy shapes the emotional valence of a woman in ways that are beyond her control, but ways that shape it positively. Trivially, in terms of, and this clashes opening opposition on long-termism, I think insofar as these hormones, because of biology, have programmed a woman to try to be as child-rearing as possible for the promulgation of her own genetics, these emotions and hormones don't know the child is not genetically different, it's not genetically the same. They act the same as if it were genetically similar to the mother, which is why it pushes the mother to have rushes of dopamine and serotonin to love the child. It gets oxytocin, which causes her to feel incredibly happy all of the time. This is a positive association that she has with the child that the other partner doesn't. This gives you some heuristic that she's likely to continue this. Second, narratives of protection. She's likely to feel compelled to protect the child because of the ways in which narratives will tell her that the mother ought to protect the child because it's the only way in which you can respect life and should be demonized of it for other reasons of it. Thirdly, and before I go on to that, I will take opening opposition.
When you take away children, there is a severe harm that is so huge that we can't have those parents have the child anymore. In any other case, would CG be okay with just taking away children and giving it to better parents because they're better parents?
I think if the experience of the child is so bad, as in it's deprived of hunger, deprived of the capacity to feel good, or at least we have probable cause, I probably maybe think so. Thirdly, on finders keepers, quite socially normatively, we accept that the first person to find something is something is the first person who should have ownership of it, particularly if they have the first chance to have a control over it. These are the reasons why we should care about primacy, analyzing over opening government, why the first person that has to go at it gets the opportunity to have some degree of belongingness. Fourthly, planning. It's quite likely that these two parents decided to have a child and therefore have economically and socially put themselves in a more of a better position than the other parents to take care of the child. They've maybe set resources aside. They've placed a world where the child has some access to things like material resources, etc. The final piece of weighing here is why the child's experience matters more than the parental experience, which is the final push from opening opposition. Parents can have a choice to have another child and they can have that experience if they want. The child has no recourse of how to experience a negative side effect. Therefore, we prioritize the utility of the child. Even if not, the deprivation of something that is unacceptable is the tainting of life. We should prevent that at all costs, even if it isn't absolutely certain. That's why you side with closing government.
Hello, can everyone hear me now?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I reached out to Ayal because I dropped off a bit halfway through the member speech and I don't think anyone responded to my text. Maybe Ayal, if you could explain what happens now.
Yes. Do you know what time of the member speech you dropped out?
Yeah, my timer was at 4:15. The last thing I heard was the analogy on the dog and how if someone doesn't take care of them quite nicely, etc., etc. And then after that, it's just patches of the speech.
If it's okay with all of the speakers to continue the speech again at that point. If not, I will get in touch with the rest of the CAP team and see for any other ideas.
I'd just like to say it also would be not ideal if there would be no voting power for this judge on this clash, because it would mean that it would be an even panel. So I'd prefer if also just Willie would be able to resume their speech as well. And it would just probably be the interest of the entire debate.
Yeah, OG is fine with it.
Oppositions, are you okay with it?
Yeah, sorry, we are absolutely.
CO is fine.
Okay, great. So let's do that.
Before we start, just to avoid like me dropping off again, I'll just reconnect my router and hopefully that the stronger internet. Again, really sorry for the inconvenience. 1 second. Okay, I think it should be fine now. But just as a safeguard, I'll keep my camera off. Again, deep apologies. Southeast Asian Wi-Fi is not the best. Yeah. Yeah, go on, speaker whenever you're ready.
Yes, okay. Can I just get clarification again? What was the last thing you specifically heard me say?
So you were just getting into the analogy of if someone doesn't take care of their dog very nicely, etc., etc.
Right, okay. Thank you. Time's not going to be useful.
Yeah, how long do you have?
How long do I have left? Sorry.
I stopped my clock. So, no worries. I stopped my clock at 4:15, so about 3 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, let me just put a different timer on for 3 minutes. Cool. So the reason that there is temporal connection, i.e. even if the child is not currently existing, but the embryo is the fact that the embryo will at one point exist. And just as we punitively, retroactively prevent people from having animals that they may have once punished of certain other animals, and we have some plausibility that they may punish the person again, suggests that in terms of the intention of hurting or the capacity to damage is something we should weigh in the debate, even if open government doesn't think so. What I'm therefore going to prove is the reasons why I think these parents, on balance of probability, likely have a sufficiently increased capacity to take care of the child. Firstly, the positive emotional shaping that comes from the hormones that the pregnant woman will have. Recognize the mother's system is biologically and evolutionary engineered to give the mother really positive feelings in order to keep having the child. These hormonal systems don't know this child is genetically different. What this means is she's likely to still experience these same things, experience the shaping of ideas and dreams and intentions to look after the child, the expression of these that are likely to follow through into at least the most vulnerable aspects of this child's life. Secondly, the narratives of protection are already shaping the mother's preferences relative to this child in a way that the other woman isn't, i.e. pregnant women are given a special responsibility to take care of the child. This mother is likely to respect that and therefore respect life more on the balanced probability than others because she has taken care of the child. Thirdly, the finders keepers analogy. It's the case that the first person who gets a finds something has some ownership over it initially until we have a reason to believe they are not good for it. This fills in the immediacy analysis as is necessary for open government's analytical stuff I was talking about earlier, i.e. why belongingness should happen to the first person to have ownership of it. And I think this gives you an intuition to why it's probably the case. I also think this is a special whereby you can redact this if the person is damaged. The fourth reason is the planning. It's probably trivially true that these two parents have planned to have a child and therefore have set up economic and social protective networks. I'm not taking you over again. And this therefore means that these individuals are likely to have a preparedness for this person, maybe a college fund so this person has a good experience, or at the very least can mitigate the probability that this child has a negative experience by having some degrees of liquidity to make sure this kid is fed very well, is housed very well, has intellectual stimulation so it can generate its own agency and intellectual well-being. On the balance of probability, O's POI, if you didn't hear it, by the way, was, well, why would we want, surely we would not take every kid away just because it's somewhat harmful. Here's the weighing against this. I think on the balance of probability, Any harm accrued to a child is more fundamentally damaging to the child than the parent. And insofar as one, the parent is not a unique experience of just this child, but rearing other children will have the same type of experience. However, for this child's individual experience, it has no alternative but to experience the thing it's about to experience, which means even minor changes in qualia, minor changes in the experience that this person has matters, and we ought to arbitrate the belongingness of this person because we're bestowing responsibility and ultimate causality to the experience this child will have, depending on who we choose to have belongingness over, for all the legal rights that give that person first action to take care of the child. We have some reason from closing government to why it's likely to be better if we have the status quo people. That's why you should side with closing government.
I thank the member of government for that speech, and again, deep apologies for having to cut off in the middle of your speech. And to continue the debate, I call upon the member of opposition.
Cool. Can I confirm I'm audible?
Yeah.
Great. Starting in 3, 2, 1. From closing opposition, we're going to rise above the dueling intuition pumps on front half and explain what OO did not, explaining why ownership of genetic material is a better criterion for determining rights claims over the embryo mechanistically, and why that supersedes the specific rights claims enumerated on the comparative by opening government. Then we're going to give a more robust explanation as to why theft, even accidental theft, is wrong. And finally, if I have time, I'm going to weigh in on the practical clash on back half. On closing government and the practical extension first. Note that this is inherently speculative and very tenuous analysis. We do not know relative income levels of both parent sets. We do not know where they live, what country they're from, what their relative social status is, and so on and so forth. One parent could be a privileged white-collar worker. The other could be a child of immigrants who's very, very poor and impoverished. One parent could have a rare genetic disease that means they'll die young. The other might not. It's very unclear. All of these things are speculative. All of these things cannot mean that you cannot evaluate the practical clash very easily. But secondly, we do not know how intentionality changes on the part of either actor at the point at which the effects of the motion get revealed, right? Parent A might no longer want the kid when they know they don't have genetic ownership over it. Parent B might now suddenly want the child and might not, and we don't know. And in the absence of this, we can't use this as an evaluative metric in the debate. But thirdly, and I want to make a new substantive contribution here, obviously someone who knows your genetic DNA and what you have a proclivity toward is likely to take better care of you. They know if you have a rare disease or proclivity for it. They know if they are neurodivergent, and so if you are likely to be neurodivergent as well. They'll have insight into similar characteristics and personality traits that you have, and will understand far more about you on the basis of genetic similarity. So on that basis, we actually think, if anything, you're more likely as a result of genetic proximity to be a better caregiver. But finally, and this is critical, this rises above everything else and knocks the CG extension out of the round. We do not determine in any other context ownership on the basis of whether someone is a better caregiver, all else being equal. That is, we do not take children of poor parents away and give them to rich parents, even if they could have better quality of life without their consent. We do not ban poor people from owning pets, even if a rich person could spoil their pet far more than I could. In cases of gross negligence, the state can take away ownership on either side of the house. That is symmetric, but we do not take away children from women who aren't biologically motherly enough or do not have enough motherly hormones or whatever because they got pregnant through non-traditional means like IVF or surrogacy or whatever they said in the last speech. These claims are out. Why is genetics the best criterion we have that we should prioritize over all other as a criterion for determining ownership? And I want to weigh against OO here. OO do a good job of explaining genetic material and why it's incredibly fundamental and important to oneself. It's a key facet of one's beings and so on and so forth. They have a couple broad intuitions here. The first is about organ harvesting. The second is about theft. I'm going to fill in this gap with mechanisms that explain why biology is a better evaluative criteria for ownership and therefore rise above the conflicting intuition pumps by directly deconstructing those of opening government. I have 5 broad reasons here. First, genetic material is a fundamental component of the self that constructs one's very basic identity, as OO correctly observes. That is, at a cellular level, it is the most fundamental thing that makes me me and makes this person the closest person to me relationally. We posit that this proximity makes this the best evaluative framework by which you are able to ascertain ownership. The reason this is true is precisely for what Dylan says. Existence is a result of moral luck. No one chooses to be born. No one chooses to exist in the first place or do anything. As a result of this, we cannot ascertain ownership over a person or thing via any other metric other than proximity. The intuition by this is why the state gives parents rights over children, because biological or social proximity is the reason why those parents have the right to exercise that right over the child. But failing this, we assess proximity on the basis of similarity, right? A community has a higher obligation to people like them. A nation has a higher obligation to people under its jurisdiction. It may not be perfect, but this is a criterion that makes sense and you can evaluate as a rubric. Secondly, in terms of proximity, the reason we don't prioritize genetic material as a source to derive rights claims is because this can be used to construct entirely new persons or utilize for organs and things like that that bear my genetic footprint and exert my influence over the world and change my perception of me long after I die. This means that their use violates my identity in a way that is far, far more deep and grave than anything on their side of the house. The reason this is true is in the same way that we consider things like microaggressions like misgendering to be bad because they cut against the very conception of the self I want to portray to the world. We think that the theft of genetic material and its use non-consensually to construct a new person or to utilize my organ without my consent leads to knock-on effects whereby my influence in the world continues to alter people's perception of me regardless of my consent. Insofar as we think that people have the absolute right to control their appearance that they project out to the world, that is, I have a right to be perceived in the way I wish I want to be, we think that people have an ownership over their genetic material in the same manner. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, the state already recognizes my right to do this in every other way, which is why we consider it illegitimate to grow new organs from stem cells without people's consent. Insofar as the state already respects this right in almost any other way, and because the misuse of the material can be incredibly dangerous on a consequential level, and also profoundly violating to you and profoundly gross feeling to you, we ought consider that revulsion to be particularly important. Fourthly, in no other context do we consider it legitimate for another actor to claim ownership over a facet of my identity, regardless of what that is, social or biological, without my consent. In the same way, we wouldn't allow a couple who received the wrong baby from a hospital to keep that baby, even if the mistake came to light later, we wouldn't allow this. But it extends more deeply than that. This is the logic by which we would not allow someone else to determine someone's gender identity for them, because you cannot allow someone to co-opt a facet of yourself without your consent. This is the mechanistic gap with an additional intuition that fills in opening opposition. But fifthly and finally, insofar as we've proven through previous mechanisms that this is an extension of myself, we think it is wrong to instrumentalize someone and use them as a means to end for positive social progress. This flips closing government, because closing government says there's some kind of practical benefit as a result of this. Even if that practical benefit is real and true, I don't know why it's fair to instrumentalize me and utilize me as a means to an end to provide a child with a better life. This is the classic thought experiment against utilitarianism, why trying to harvest the organs of one person to save 5 people in a hospital and things like this. For that reason, even if they get a practical benefit on their side of the house, on our side of the house, insofar as that genetic material is me, you have no right to instrumentalize me in order to achieve a positive social end. Before I explain why this overrides everything else on opening government, I'll take opening government.
So either you buy CG's 4 points of rebuttal against us, we're the only team in the debate that hasn't justified our moral claims on intuitions, which are cross-culturally various and rapidly changing.
I just gave mechanisms, and now I'm going to explain why your intuitions are wrong. Their criterion are twofold. The first criterion opening government gives you is discontinuity of identity. Opening opposition deals with this okay, but if I steal property from someone, I think that that's a fair response. Dylan says the embryo got mixed up, but it still possesses your genetic material. But think about it. If I steal a Lego toy, which has building blocks and you construct it from Dylan, and then mash it up with my own, that doesn't mean the pieces still don't belong to Dylan for that reason, which makes it a flawed evaluative metric. But secondly, they say ownership based on proximity. But obviously, if I fly to London, my parents biologically are still my parents because they're more proximate to me relationally, even if not geographically. So we went on that proximity metric. But thirdly, intention to fulfill responsibility. It's entirely unclear this is true. We don't know whether one parent finds out this information, they still want to raise this child. We don't know if the other parents want the child back or not. Given that we cannot weigh on the basis of intention to fulfill responsibility either, it is speculative. Then they say, you accepted the terms of a moral obligation by caring for the child. The reason this doesn't work is twofold. First, I as a thief can accept that I care for stolen belongings. No one believes this represents belonging because I recognize the original owner of the belongings has a higher moral claim. But secondly, acceptance as an obligation of care does not imply belonging. But finally, ownership requires a consensual transfer between prior owner and previous owner. Importantly, this is true even if someone purchases a stolen car that later ends up after a dealership that you buy from a dealership officially after a theft. You should still return it to the original owner. That is, if I steal a car from Naomi, for example, and give it to Dylan, even if Dylan bought the car under the assumption that I didn't steal it from Naomi, we'd still believe the car originally belonged to Naomi on our side of the house. This is the more robust defense of the principle of theft than opening opposition gives, and fills in the mechanistic gap that is missing from opening opposition in regards to their intuition pump. I flipped all of CG's practical concerns. I've given more analytically robust principled reasons that are mechanistic as opposed to based on intuition to fill the gap in opening opposition, and I flipped the evaluative criterion that opening government gives, which opening opposition never did in this debate. Incredibly proud to win from closing up.
I thank the member of opposition for that speech, and also next call the government whip to close the government bench. Here.
Okay, am I audible?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay. Right, I'll take POIs in the chat, preferably for opening opposition, and I'll take it around 5 minutes. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I want to respond to the 3 pushbacks that we got from Matt, then respond to closing opposition, way against opening government, and finally discuss opening opposition. The first thing is that you do not know the situation of the parents. 2 responses here. First of all, William's mechanisms relied upon biological imperatives that are forced upon you when you are a mother, forced upon you when you are a parent, and things like this. These imperatives are fixed through evolution, which means even if you are poor, even if you have situations where you could be a bad parent or things like that, then presumably these would still be fine because you would still look after the child in relative to the conditions which you find yourself in the first place. But second of all, even if these could be somewhat speculative, biting the bullet of closing opposition, some utility certainty in this debate is important for all the top framing and weighing that William has given you about why agency is after utility, i.e. that utility has to come first for you to give agency to the children. This has not been rebutted by Matt yet. If you say that utility has to then produce the agency, then some utility claims in this debate matter because the agency of the child is through you child rearing it, through you making it grow up into being a human, and therefore we access the agency claims later down the line as well. That has not been responded to. Then, secondly, on genetic proximity, and you may not know about genetic diseases, 2 responses. When you donate the embryo, you probably have to give up this information by law, and you probably know about this. Second of all, the Infoslide says that there's been genetic testing, and therefore you probably know about this in the first place. I don't think this is a very powerful response against us. Then they say, you do not take away children, because motherness is not a reason for the state to take away your children. 2 responses. 1, this is a unique scenario and a unique thought experiment. This is happening once. The state does not do this all the time, but presumably, if, for example, your parents abuse the child, that is a scenario where you can take that child away from you. But also, and this is really important, if you are unsure or there is an unknown about whether you know that child is going to be taken care of, but you know there are biological mechanisms through which there is a small certainty that that child will be looked after, the state defaults on the burden of proof that's given to reach the most certainty threshold in most law that we exist under, which means you would preference the couple A in this motion in the first place. Second of all, I just think that we could just give other structural reasons as to why the other mother is probably traumatized. They probably don't like the fact that bodily autonomy has not been taken into consideration. They, all these sorts of things. There's lots of uncertainty also on op as to whether this person would think that they would necessarily take care of it as well. Therefore, you should side with the one that's more biological in this motion. Then let's respond to closing opposition analysis. This, I only want to respond to you cannot let someone else determine your identity. I have 4 responses to this. First of all, coercion is symmetric because both parents would be instrumentalizing their child in the first instance. But second of all, we can never know if the parent on op has good intentions either. Therefore, we should just not randomly default to them in the first place. But the third response is the most important response I'm giving to closing opposition. Couple B is instrumentalizing babies for the identity of them as parents. This is most important because couple B is violating the rights of the child just to instrumentalize the child so they can own that child. They have no control. They have no ability. They have no justification to instrumentalize a baby just so they can take that baby. That is also just doubly violating that baby in the first place. There's a violation from couple A owning the child, and there's a violation from couple B instrumentalizing that child. Therefore, there's 2 coercions. You should prioritize the only one coercion, which is the thing that we'll bite the bullet on in the first place. But also, being human and being able to fulfill your human needs is a baseline. Presumably, couple A gives this child a basic standard of living. Otherwise, the state would take away this baby as well, and we'll just go back to circular argumentation. So presumably, if everything else, like teenagers, what color you dye your hair is random, doesn't matter on the parents. All the genetics are fixed anyway. Presumably this baseline still matters on both sides. I don't know why this identity would be shaped so massively in the first instance. Then let's weigh against opening government. Several pieces of weighing. First of all, in PM, they say it's deeply traumatic to the woman to say it doesn't belong to her. I just want to flag here that they never say what this deep traumatization is. William gives you the mechanizations of what this trauma is. Then they say, oh, the baby has changed because of their mother's conditions. The arm analysis that William gives you is really important. You cause harm to a person if you chop off, for example, my arm. Doesn't mean that William owns me. Identity does not make you belong to someone. For example, I could disown my parents because they're homophobic to me. Therefore, just because you are the parent doesn't mean you own it as well. But also, change doesn't mean in the womb means you own it. We have more rights with the CG mechanization to prove more certainty of rights. But second of all, the weighing of child utility. The child's well-being and development is the most important thing in this debate to prove that the baby is going to have a sound life. William gave you that mechanization of utility in the first place. It's not about just owning it. It's about the child in and of itself in the first instance. Secondly, on having to opt in and moral luck. The other mother may want to opt in the first place. but you also then cannot adjudicate it because it's random. The mother may not have consented into having that child if it isn't theirs. Luck is also arbitrary. Luck doesn't fall asymmetric on either of them. Therefore, OG has a circular argumentation problem. But two pieces of weighing here. One, just responsibility. You have more responsibility to the mechanization that William's given you. You will definitely have more obligations from the state that's placed upon you to have a more responsibility over it. Therefore, you're likely to meet that. But second of all, certainty. We know that there's more certainty that you will look after this child and this child will be delivered safely because of the mechanisms of biology that we've explained. Because you have more certainty that the opt-in from the person from the mother will mean that the opt-in will lead there's a certainty to that child being born. It's not about luck, because that luck could mean that that child is born badly. Opening opposition.
Matt tries to steal that POI from us just as much as that entire extension. It was us that told you that it's not legitimate to take away children and give it to better parents.
The panel can adjudicate opposition bench. They're very good judges. Then on intentionality, that does not prove that the other person consents is intentionality. Intentionality doesn't matter because the parents are the vehicle through which the child is born. The child outcomes are more important because both mothers could have had intentionality. The way you break this intentionality deadlock is what matters for the child, and that's why you should side with us in this debate. But on the social construct and geography being most important, social construct is not important if the outcomes of the child are most important. We also give you biological imperative mechanisms which are more structurally sound than social constructs which can be differently disagreed upon by different people. I mean, look at that fucking round 4 motion, that was stupid. Then finally, proximity is also just not important in this debate for all the reason that if you stand near someone, doesn't necessarily mean that you are owning that child. Finally, I just want to point out against opening opposition is that genetic code doesn't mean you have an automatic right. If you harm someone or you have abusive parents, that means that can be taken away from you. If you don't know what they wanted, you default to certainty way. The only thing you can be certain about is the child outcomes in this debate. This child would be way better off if it's based on this mother rather than the other mother for the uncertainty that's way higher on their side. For those reasons, closing government.
Thank the member of government for that speech, and to end the debate as a whole, I call upon the opposition whip. Here.
Just checking the audible.
Yeah, loud and
two things in the speech. First, bunch of responses, both to closing government and opening government. Lastly, by genetic is the criterion that is comparatively better than any other criterion in the debate in terms of how we establish ownership. On closing government, the first thing on the metric of utility, I would note that Matt did actually respond to this, right? Utility is going to be secondary in this debate to the same extent as we have rights in society that are socially disutile all the time. For example, we do allow people to have ownership over their organs, even though it possibly sometimes would be socially utile to be able to harvest them. We do that constantly, therefore it's always going to be secondary. But next, on that intuition, right? Like they say, they say that sometimes we do violate genetics as the reason for ownership. That is fair. That probably responds to opening government, who just explains that genetics is really important and it really matters to people. Closing government correctly points out it is not the absolute criterion. But the intuition that CG then has is that state can take away children who might be in risk of absolute harm, right? The problem with them, and I think Matt already pointed out as well, and they don't really rebuild it, is that they do not fulfill the explanation that this scenario is analogous to the intuition that they are giving, right? We would only do these things if there is a huge harm to the child. We don't redistribute children to better parents if the current parents are maybe a bit worse, but they are still acceptable. they do not prove any huge harm would occur to the child if they were with the genetic parents. If it is true and the genetic parents wanted to give up the embryo regardless, then we can just ask them, given that they are located, and if that was the intention, they can simply consent, and then couple A can keep the ownership of that child. Now it's going to belong to them. That is fair. They also might have wanted it for themselves. CG says that's not possible, because why else would they undergo the IVF? I would point out that many times couples do need to undergo it, even if it is their biological child, for example, for reasons like problems with infertility, meaning that it requires that kind of medical intervention. So there is a very much sensible case of that this couple intended this child to be for themselves. Therefore, they would have the planning required. But also, like, even if you think that the consequences matter, I think Matt already pointed out, and they do not respond back to it, that there are actually like substantial reasons that we can point out as to why the genetic parents would be still better, right? Like, first, Matt points out that they would probably understand the genetic conditions of the child, like possible illnesses that might come later in their lives, right? Like things that biological parents are able to predict, able to make sure that it can be prevented or mitigated, right? For example, a child might be a different ethnicity from the parent that they are now being born to, that can't introduce them to their culture, that can't prepare them for having to live the life in that live the life of being an ethnic minority, for example. We don't know any of those things. There are very reasonable reasons why why couple A would probably might be not a particularly well-prepared parent. But also, we don't know whether the couple A will want the child afterwards, right? They might want to give up the child. They might feel very disconnected from the child. They might not want to care for them properly. All of this is necessarily speculative. Closing government does not fulfill at all the burden of claiming that there is a severe harm that would happen to child that would happen to the child if they remain with their biological parent. They also do not prove that it would not be even comparatively worse if they went to the couple A. Closing government is going to be out of the debate. I'm going to deal with some of the bits that come from opening government. And I do think that Matt already engages a bunch of it, but I want to respond to some more. They say that there is no responsibility for the mix-up by couple A. The implication of that is not that therefore they have the ownership over the embryo, right? It is merely that we shouldn't be punishing them for or making them morally culpable for that mix-up. Like if a pile of money appears in my room tomorrow, even if I did not steal it, if it is found out that someone else stole it from someone, I still ought to return it, right? It still belongs to the person that it was initially taken from. Even if I say I accept the money, which is that other thing, like you accepted it. I can't just accept those things if it belongs to someone else who has superior ownership over it than me. Then they say, like, and you might form some form of relationship. There might be some consequences to you over the time that the embryo was with the couple A, right? That again does not imply belonging. At best, it implies that perhaps we should compensate couple A in some way. Perhaps we should be redoing the procedure for them so that they get to have the biological child that they intended to have. Does not imply any sort of ownership. It implies that perhaps there is a desert for compensation. The final thing then that they have on this is the idea about transformation. I think Matt already points out that that is not true, but I would note that even if you just take the opening government's analysis in and of themselves, right? Like they don't even explain it properly. Look at the analogy that they are giving, right? They say the intuition pump they say is that if there is a tree that doesn't belong to anyone, if Dylan makes a chair out of it, now the chair belongs to Dylan. But again, the problem is that the tree in their scenario doesn't belong to anyone. In this scenario, this is something that does belong to someone, and therefore it is deeply unclear why that would be in any way analogous scenario. Before I'm going to talk about the extension, I will take opening government.
So when we say the other couple has also gone through pregnancy, obviously CG is out. But even if you buy up to crazy bioessentialism stuff, Erasmus told you the biological matter of the surrogate mother is in the child now, and how they care for them will determine who they are in life. Okay, I had the sound got really muffled. If it was really smart, well, good luck. I don't know. Sorry. Okay. On the extension, why then is genetic the criterion that is preferable over any other criteria? I think both in combination of what I said and what Matt already explained, we dealt with all the alternative explanations for ownership that came from both from opening government and then from closing government. I want to note what O says here, right? O explains, to their credit, that genetic material is really important to people. They call out with some intuitions about organs. The problem with that is that they don't explain beyond the intuition why genetic is a better evaluative metric
as to why we ascertain ownership than all the things that other teams say. And know that the closing government response that genetic material is not it's not absolute, is somewhat fair, right? They point out that there are instances in which we can override it. Therefore, it is important where Matt explains why it is comparatively better. Matt explains both in terms of similarity, in terms of the fact that we can't just, someone cannot just claim facets of my identity, right? The fact that we cannot instrumentalize and to the extent that closing government says like parents instrumentalize children on both sides, there is not comparative to the violent instrumentalization. We are literally stealing away a mass facet of yourself. And you are creating a new person that you can't have any control over, that is actually using a means to an end. Even if this is a more robust justification, but it is certainly distinct, and we do respond to Gov Bench. So even if we don't first, we definitely second it's an off bench.
I thank the opposition for that speech and everyone for an excellent round. Feel free to cross the floor and virtually shake hands and exit the room to allow the panel to deliberate.